Our first presentation is from Jess Harris. She's a research fellow at the Health and Social Care Workforce Research Unit at King's College London. She led the NIHR School for Social Care research-funded study on strengthening adult safeguarding responses to homelessness and self-neglect. And she's going to tell us about her findings today. So over to you, Jess.
Thank you so much, Candice. And the first thing I really wanted to emphasize is that homelessness is not just a housing issue, which we all know it is nationally. And although we've got this massive increase of people experiencing homelessness in all forms and increasing number of deaths of people experiencing homelessness, what isn't always widely understood is that the average age of death, if you're homeless, is in your early to mid 40s, whether you are a man or a woman. So we are really talking about a highly at-risk population, and a population where homelessness overlaps with a multitude of other forms of social exclusion and disadvantage, like mental and physical ill health and substance use and massive trauma and adverse childhood experiences, and a range of other factors that really put this population at risk. And a population who've often experienced disadvantage alongside discrimination and stigma. So they may not trust services, they may not seek help, and they may not accept help when offered. So no prior research had looked at this group, but we do have strong evidence that preceded our study from safeguarding adult reviews into homeless deaths, and those clearly pointed to a failure of safeguarding. So we embarked on this study to look at how to strengthen safeguarding responses, and we quickly widened the gaze. Because so little safeguarding was taking place, we looked at alternative forums, and processes to manage risk outside safeguarding, and we looked at day-to-day practice. And we did this through a variety of methods, but it's the interviews that I'm really briefly sharing with you today, with the 82 practitioners working in adult social care and safeguarding, but also across wider services that work alongside them with this population, and really and crucially with people who are experiencing homelessness and multiple disadvantage themselves. Next, please. And the challenges we found were considerable. We found very little safeguarding, and the alerts were often not responded to, and people would stop putting them in or would simply see it as an administrative process of just covering their back. And the first block was very much practitioner attitudes, uncertainties about whether homelessness fits with safeguarding, whether homelessness fits under the wider umbrella of adult social care, and really whether people who are self-neglecting, who are not accessing healthcare, they're not eating, they're not keeping warm or safe, whether those people needed adult safeguarding. After all, what happens if there's no perpetrator? And there was often a real barrier to support where self-neglect was seen as a choice because substance use is one of the features, and there wasn't the professional curiosity looking behind the substance use to see what was going on for an individual. And often also a sort of raising of the thresholds of safeguarding quite unnecessarily, because thresholds are quite low. So saying things like, oh, well, they've got capacity, or they haven't consented, or they don't have a local connection. None of these things are actually barriers to us safeguarding somebody. So as this quote says, we could say lifestyle choice, or they're living on the street and I really can't assess them, or they're not engaging, and there were many reasons for services to walk away. Next, please. So other challenges were where safeguarding is really just being used to register concern across different services, because there are stalemates where perhaps, as the first illustration suggests, there was sort of squabbling over who should fund and support a complex individual with needs, or where services are just unavailable, and for example, a hostel can't get mental health or adult social care to come and support their residents. So repeated alerts were going to adult safeguarding, whose staff were quite understandably feeling very frustrated. What can we do in this situation? But as a result, the bigger picture is one really of increasing levels of unmet need and risks. And often the place that shows up across the social care and health system is in repeated use of emergency services. And as that quote illustrates, people will spiral through A&E services each time a safeguarding alert would be put in, but ultimately there was no service to respond. So a key concern for us nationally is to consider if we are really addressing the gaps that might be prompting these repeat safeguarding alerts. So because very little risk was being managed within adult safeguarding, we look wider to the other forums and processes where this risk was being managed. And the main challenge was often that there's no one clear pathway in a locality, and there may be multiple forums, which may be incredibly well-meaning and have been set up to address different short or long-term risk management goals. And often they don't actually have the leverage to do anything more than share information. So the positive practice that we found is where we have systematic multidisciplinary forums that can match adult safeguarding in having the leadership and infrastructure. They have the leverage to get people round the table and the scrutiny of the Safeguarding Adults Board, the governance function to oversee this important process. But crucially, unlike adult safeguarding, they may bring specialist expertise in this area. And the quote cites something about meeting fortnightly. All these people are at risk. What can we do to make a difference? So not waiting for that risk to escalate. And we went to talk to people who are experiencing homelessness and self-neglect and who had often had safeguarding alerts or referrals put in, although nothing had been done. And there are two really, really powerful quotes that I encourage you to read. But essentially what we often found is a lack of awareness of this as a service, because after all, safeguarding was something people understandably associate with child protection. But what we did hear about is severe self-neglect, but people describing why they still would not accept or seek out their support because of a myriad of barriers. And the distrust and the ill health or the addiction, utter despair that would stop them from accepting help, but were very grateful when support ignored that initial brush off and practitioners stuck by and built up trusted relationships and enabled them to begin to access services. And as the second quote clearly illustrates, people were often able to reflect on the very life they were leading right now, and they felt utterly trapped in and were perplexed that actually statutory services were not intervening to safeguard. So the real concern I'd flag here is that often services were saying to us, if somebody's not engaging or if they're making unwise decisions, even if we haven't assessed their capacity to make that decision, that's an off switch. So the services would not remain engaged despite those high levels of risks. And there's a link to the current study I'm doing to explore this further. Next, please. So positive practice was there. And when you go out and you talk to practitioners, of course, you find the most amazing, passionate, tenacious individuals who are working despite stretched, under-resourced systems, and they're overcoming barriers. And this was often led by individuals and not systematic. But where it was more systematically embedded, we found the specialist homelessness social work role, which brings that expertise, the skills and flexibility to address the risks and offer support and reduce inequalities out on the streets, in hostels, and where it's needed. But this is a really challenging and rare role at the moment. It's often very short term. And so there's a clear need to drive the rollout and embedding of this systematically. And I did a small follow-up study and helped to establish a peer network if you're interested in following this up. And crucially, for good practice, we need the multidisciplinary teams that can build on the excellent specialist social work, because these are multifaceted risks. So to overcome that lack of information sharing and that antagonistic siloed working, the really good practice is where people are working across expertise in a shared trauma-informed way with shared resources. So again, a more preventative approach to reduce a reliance on emergency services, and ironically, not increase, but to reduce the reliance on adult safeguarding. So I leave you with a checklist to consider locally, that we should really be considering our attitudes. Are we accepting discrimination and gatekeeping? What's happening in our service approaches, whether they're within safeguarding or risk management or in day-to-day practice? And what's happening with our oversight and governance? Are we really learning from these processes so we are not caught in this cycle of risk and early death? And ultimately, the ultimate test is, are we improving outcomes for these highly at-risk individuals? Next, please. And I leave you with a link to a range of other resources if you'd like to look into this further, including the animation that these images are all taken from. Thank you very much.